There were 6 or 7 of us sitting in our usual seats in the corner of the coffee shop, waiting for him to broach the subject. Our old friend was silent for a while. Then a nostalgic smile appeared on his face, as if a dream from the past had come alive before his eyes. "You must have heard of it," he began. "There is a saying, 'He who has no sheikh has the devil as his sheikh.' This is perhaps the most appropriate thing to say about the deceased whose funeral we are attending today. But don't let this mislead you. This word can only be used to explain that he was not like everyone else, not because he was a good or bad person." "Well, his story is worth listening to," said one of us. Another showed that he didn't care, as if to object. "What could we possibly not know about him? He stays out of trouble, doesn't get involved in anything, has no quarrels with anyone, is a quiet person, isn't he?" "You are right." Our old friend confirmed what was said. "Until recently, what I would have said would have been similar opinions. An acquaintance who was living the last period of his life, quietly, with modest pleasures such as growing flowers in his garden, occasionally riding his bike, and strolling along the canal. One day, after one such canal tour, he stopped by the lodging of the department where I worked, and joined us in enjoying the samovar we were brewing under the pergola in the garden. It was as if he was in another world and experiencing the joy of spring to the bone. Along the way, his eyes had seen nothing but the beauty of colorful wildflowers. It was as though he was mesmerized. "You are the only ones who see this," said the servant, pouring the tea into cups, as it were waking him from his reverie. "For the people here, the wildflowers along the canal are nothing but weeds and thorns." I am sure he knew this too. He just wanted to share with us how he sees life. The first objector was insistent on his opinions. "Doesn't this show us how distant he is from people? He has withdrawn into his own world, reduced his contact with people to a minimum, and condemned himself to a solitary life." When asking for forgiveness before the funeral prayer, the thought that came to mind was, who could possibly owe him anything, or owe him anything? Our old friend said, "If there is no difference between condemning oneself and making a choice, can we say that this was one's choice?" The other one shrugged his shoulders to show that he didn't care, but he didn't respond. The subject didn't change. Our old friend continued. "I met his younger brother who came to visit him during his last days in the hospital. He was one of those rare people who didn't wait years to become close to his brother. We got along quickly. I stopped by the hotel where he was staying. We talked for a long time. You couldn't meet him because he left before the funeral." I asked curiously, "What did he tell you?" The little brother in the hotel lobby delved into the depths of his memory with a nostalgic start. "My mother suffered a lot with his toilet training," he began. "He gave her a hard time that she hadn't had with her previous 2 children. Every morning, he would find the bed wet." The unfortunate woman later admitted that it was because of her own bogey stories that the little boy could not go to the toilet in the house at night. Stories with bogeymen. There was a house in the neighborhood with no one living in it. Even though he would pass a little bit outside during the day, at night he would pass farther away from that house, as if brushing against the opposite wall. The bogeymen were almost identical with darkness. Even the inside of their own house became a place for the bogeymen. At night, he would want someone to accompany him to the kitchen or other room, 5 meters away from the room they were sitting in. Naturally, we, as his siblings, did not want to sleep in the same bed with him. Darkness, loneliness, and fear. I do not remember how and when this psychological problem, which took root in his childhood and lasted for a long time, was resolved. Although late, he eventually learned to hold his urine. We were more like friends than brothers. I never called him brother. He never insisted on me calling him brother, even though I called him by his first name. When we were kids, we climbed to the top of the mountain on which the city was built with my friends. Later, he started climbing again every year. One summer when he came on vacation, he offered me a climb to the top. Although I accepted his request and joined him, after a while I decided to turn back because the weather was unbearably hot. The climb to the top, which took about 6 hours, was unbearable in that heat. He was determined. He continued climbing, and I returned home while the road was still open. He did not come that night, nor the next day. But he returned more than a day later, towards evening, exhausted from fatigue. He ate a few mouthfuls and went to sleep. When he woke up, I sat down in front of him and asked him to tell me. After I left you, I continued climbing for a long time. The lack of a trail or a goat path made climbing difficult. Finally, I came to a place where it was impossible to go any further. I was going to turn around and try to find another way, but I had lost the path I had come from, in the bushes that surrounded me. I was glad to find a small, dry stream bed with not a drop of water in it. This path would take me straight to the valley. After a difficult descent through the thick vegetation, where no sky was visible, I finally saw an open area a short distance below. In order to get there, I leaned down from the narrow place I was in and let myself go into the void. This place resembled an eagle's nest. The front was a steep cliff. The right side connected to this cliff and was a dead end. The back side was impossible to return to where I came from. Only the left side was dangerous enough to pass. I sat down, stretched my legs, leaned my back against the rock, and fixed my eyes on the city below. This place was first an eagle's nest, then it gradually turned into an ivory tower. I was in a difficult situation to get out of. It got dark. The lights came on in the city. Naturally, I didn't sleep a wink until morning. There was a very steep area of about 3 meters, which was thought-provoking. If I could pass this part covered with small stones without sliding towards the cliff with the stones, I could overcome the following parts with less anxiety. I started to cross the rocky area, almost sticking to the ground face down. I think I went through at least half an hour of testing, with cold sweat running down my back, along with the next 7 or 8 meters of dangerous territory. I realized that the price of the ivory tower was very high. He was passionate about summiting mountains. For this reason, he would travel to regions with the highest peaks in the country. Moreover, he would do it alone every time. I don't know if he had similar adventures, but later he added photography to this climbing sport. He would climb castles in many cities he visited, and take bird's-eye and panoramic photographs. He would specifically record photographs of general and specific parts of cities. He who does not climb to great heights cannot see far, he would say. But his aim was to gain depth as much as to broaden the horizon. And of course, cycling. I don't think cycling trips were any less than mountain climbing in terms of his perspective on life. He went on cycling trips that lasted for days. I believe these trips played a role in his learning the history, geography, and people of the country. He described the unforgettable difficulties he had experienced during such a long journey. He never stayed in a hotel, never went to a restaurant. In the trunk of his bicycle he had a pan, a small tent he had made from feed sacks and repair materials. Dehydration and malnutrition had an immediate effect. On the first night of that long journey, while trying to sleep in a secluded place near the road, he was invaded by mosquitoes, one of the country's problems of a century ago. His resistance was broken, and he decided to return. He packed up and set off. Midnight. Pitch-black darkness reminiscent of a cave. No way in sight. No one coming or going. With disappointment, as daybreak finally dawned, I climbed the back wall of the 2,000-year-old theater that still stands a short distance away and went inside. I walked from the audience area to the stage. I tried to imagine what it looked like from each point. The audience, the actors, and even someone from outside watching the play and the audience as a whole. When I left the theater, the sun had not yet risen. I cycled for a while along the path between the fields. The ruins of the aqueducts were visible. I could not go back because of the mosquitoes. I had to keep going. The younger brother, whose mind I sensed was fixated on a memory in the dim light of the hotel lobby, remained silent for a while. Then he almost returned to the beginning of his story and said, "There is something else that is really effective. An accident." I was curious. An accident. A bitter smile appeared on his face. A life experience that will leave deep scars. Another danger that will replace the bogeyman. But first, I must talk about another subject, where all of them are experienced together. Although we were not in need, my father had the idea of making us work outside, which he saw as part of our education and preparation for life. He was the one of the siblings who did the most peddling of any kind imaginable, from the age of 12. From selling soda and sunflower seeds in summer cinemas, to selling newspapers in the city. From selling eggs in neighborhood markets to selling insect repellent. And from selling plastic children's toys during holidays, there is no sector he has not entered. He would start the day when my father woke him up to sell morning bagels in the middle of the night, when it was not yet dawn. With a tin can with a lid under his arm in which he placed the bagels, he would walk the streets saying, "Hot, hot, fresh bagels," he would shout. One of the memories we have in common that we enjoy recalling is that every time he came home for lunch on hot summer days, we would spread out the newspapers and magazines he sold on the living room floor and get lost in each one. So much so that he sometimes surprised me by earning more than my father. Much later, his business life, in which he accepted defeat with humor, ended in a nationwide economic crisis. For the sake of the country's interests, I am renouncing the business of making money, so as not to do more harm to the country. I think this commercial life provided free environments where he experienced taking initiative, until he deeply felt the helplessness of being tied to his hands. There was a richness of humor in the younger brother's style of speaking, in which sincerity was clearly evident. He was somewhere between studying and not studying. He was failing every class, prolonging his education. He made good use of the opportunities that the system gave to such students to spend a year of their lives outside of school, so that they could come to their senses. In order to learn well, he studied in the same classes twice. He was among the most senior students in the school. He was not a successful student in appearance. Despite the age difference between us, we were both in the same class in the senior year. Strangely enough, unlike many seemingly successful students at school, when we graduated, we both got into the schools we wanted for higher education. I think his teachers were surprised by the unexpected success of the, quote, double-stitch student. However, at that time he was in the midst of an incurable disease that he had been suffering from for a long time. The beginning of this story began 5 years ago, when he experienced what was destined to happen. In other words, when he had an accident. This was an event he had never encountered before in his street life. Naturally, it was not among his experiences. It did not appeal to his mind. It was irrational. He realized that he was caught helplessly, tightly. He could not move, he froze. All his willpower had disappeared. He knew one thing. That was that those who caught this disease never recovered. After spending a year outside, he entered the school from which they had kicked him out the door, through the window. A new class, new faces, new friends. He didn't understand anything at first. In a short time, one of the faces in the class somehow got into his head, never to leave. Then, in a way he couldn't understand, he started seeing her everywhere. He was always thinking about her, everywhere, all the time. He couldn't talk to her, couldn't make eye contact. That never happened. Even though they had been in the same class for a few years, breathing the same air, he couldn't get close to her. Outside, when they met, he would stop what he was doing, watch her from a distance, and follow her home each time. There was no future in his dreams. In fact, there was no dream of a future for him. An obsession. No, that word would be inadequate to describe what he experienced. To tell the truth, he didn't get stuck at one point. He couldn't get her out of his mind. But when he tried to give a name to what he was experiencing, he thought the closest name was the word love. A one-way, divine love that didn't expect anything in return. And he was thankful for the strong feelings he felt. The girl's beauty had awakened those indescribable feelings in him. The younger brother was silent for a while. I couldn't guess how the story would continue. Could it be that the reason for settling so far from home was a broken heart? I don't know. But I underestimated the subject of a broken heart. He took her with him when he went from the countryside to the big city for higher education. Would you believe it if I said that I swallowed my little tongue in surprise when I heard these words? He was with her all the time. And this continued for years. I almost stuttered. What do you mean? Quote. His answer was short, definite, and convincing. Like a mental patient. This time the silence lasted a bit longer. A completely secretive person. There was a complete contrast between the calmness that dominated his external appearance and the storms he experienced in his inner world. Perhaps a state of surrender could be explanatory in describing him. He was content with his fate, with what happened to him, and he was thankful for it. I guess I am repeating this. A state of surrender and gratitude. Is his story over? No, answered the younger brother to his own question. As long as he draws breath, it will continue. But now it is time for another subject. He thought that cities were like people. Settlements that were born like a living being, grew, matured, developed a personality, and then lost their vitality for various reasons. While he was in the formation phase of this idea, the traces of which he tried to see in the photographs he took, he was assigned to a remote part of the countryside. It was, in fact, an exceptional place for escape. It was far from the big cities, and was seen as a place of deprivation, a place of exile for many who had expectations from life. But for him it was like an ivory tower, an opportunity to consolidate his thoughts. A settlement with a history dating back to ancient times, with its ancestors' wood-based cultural heritage in the middle of a vast forest sea, with the rich vegetation of the north. Such a peaceful harmony of nature and culture was an experience he had never experienced before. The houses where the people had displayed the richness of their inner worlds for centuries, the workplaces in the bazaars, coffee houses, inns, baths, places of worship, all reflected their lifestyles. There were traces of an aesthetic concern in these structures that did not only serve practical purposes. Wherever he looked, he saw a painting by a master painter. The realities he experienced resembled a rich fantasy world. It was as if he was inside that painting and living in an incredible dream, until all of this turned into a nightmare. I was holding my breath. What could happen? When he was inevitably introduced to the district governor, he did not expect to have a person he could talk to. However, this experienced administrator soon became someone he would visit regularly. He would often send him messages and wait for him to drink tea by the small pool in the garden of the district governor's office after work. This middle-aged man had no ambition to rise higher in the bureaucratic ranks. At the very beginning of his career, he was at the pinnacle of his reach. He had accepted this position and was trying to fulfill his duty perfectly. His potential to become a governor was, as if it were a universal rule, dictated by circumstances beyond his personal capabilities. But this could not be a reason to neglect what was expected of him. The statesman's speeches were not unfamiliar to him. They would share their thoughts without getting into arguments about fate and will. He was a complete, quote, problem solver when it came to solving the problems faced by the people. He asked him about his own vital problem. Have you ever encountered an unsolvable problem? The district governor responded seriously. We cannot remain spectators to events. The state is the will. He appreciated him. The bookish equivalent of Mulcahy showed that he had internalized the spirit of being a statesman. No, said the district governor. I hope we will not encounter such situations. The unsolvable problem is the state of harm experienced by the state and the citizens. He particularly pondered this answer. But finally he muttered, Take your medicine away, doctor. The heat of summer was behind us, and the coolness of autumn had already begun to make itself felt in the district. The nature, which was rapidly losing its vibrant colors, was turning into dark, dull colors that reminded of extinction, giving an unpleasant pessimism to the human soul. The property manager, who had just arrived in the district on assignment, had no difficulty in finding a house to rent and immediately brought his family there. No one could have known that the dry and cold wind that came from the north that day and immediately intensified and turned into a storm was a sign of disaster. In the evening, when the wife of the property manager was bringing in the barbecue she had lit in the garden, she thought she heard a knock on the street door and went to open it. The door was thrown wide open by the storm, and the barbecue in the center of the wooden living room was suddenly knocked over by the violent airflow. Without realizing what had happened, the embers of coal spread around and ignited the dry wooden floor. The woman was horrified by the suddenly growing flames. When the men left the evening prayers, the fire, whose flames could be seen in the distance, had not yet spread to other houses. When the district fire brigade arrived with its inadequate equipment, there were women and children gathered around. With strong foresight, the district governor was on the phone, trying to reach the governor. The effect of the gale was strong, and the fire could not be prevented from spreading to other houses. Not knowing what to do, the adults rushed left and right, only to realize that all their efforts were in vain. It was clear that they were faced with an unpreventable situation. Although it was said that help was coming from the governor and nearby settlements, the uncontrollable fire continued to spread. Crop payments to farmers were in the vaults of the only bank branch in the district, and the bank building was now among the burning buildings. In addition, official buildings such as the government house, courthouse, gendarmerie, post office, military service branch, and prison were completely destroyed. Our dreams often exceed reality, but this time reality was beyond dreams. The fire and the wind had become the trigger for an irresistible disaster. All the people gathered in groups could do was cry and whine, expressing helplessness. Not only were their properties turning to ashes before their eyes, but the wealth they had inherited from their ancestors was also disappearing one by one. The bazaars, inns, baths, mosques, and workplaces that made up their entire world, just like their homes, were completely surrendered to the flames. The first to arrive from outside the district were the governor and his fire truck. The people were hopeless. There was a great danger that the fire would spread to the forest adjacent to the district. The fire chief took precautions to prevent the spread of the disaster, which had spread over a wide area and was clearly unstoppable no matter where one started. At daybreak, with the wind ceasing, the fire was seen to be dying down, and people were beginning to leave the town in a panic. Most of the people who had spent the night in the cold and sleepless, including children, were leaving the town with their relatives who came to pick them up from nearby villages in horse-drawn carriages. 2/3 of the settlement had been destroyed. The faces of all the officials were tired and sullen. The smell of burning was pervasive. Every now and then a glimmer of flame attempted to revive among the still smoking piles of ashes, but was immediately drowned by water. Did all this indicate a curse? A jinx? No. In his submission, he would not accept this. He could only say it was the manifestation of fate. It was the biggest fire the country had ever seen in its history. Undoubtedly, people would build a new life, but this life would be completely distant from the identity of the city, which they would keep alive as long as they lived with strong nostalgia for the memories that were deeply rooted in their minds. A grim tableau of devastation unfolded, a haunting echo of times past when fleeing enemies would set the world ablaze. The fiery ballet with the wind was a macabre dance with death, forever etched in their memories. He couldn't remember whether the journalists or the higher state officials came first, maybe both at the same time. The deputy prime minister made morale-boosting speeches, constantly emphasizing that the state was on the side of its citizens in the face of this painful disaster. He did not know whether he was facing only 1/10 of the city, or whether the disaster victims who had returned from nearby villages to meet him were also there. The statesman compared the small number of casualties with the disasters the country had faced at other times and expressed gratitude for them. But he did not dwell on it much, considering the suffering of his relatives. The aid was not only domestic but also international. There were discussions in the parliament about what the government could do in those days. Laws were proposed. In a short time, mass housing was built. At first these were said to be gratuitous, but later the payments were tied to installments. Unaccounted expenditures were probably among the items that disrupted the normal service plans of governments and upset budget balances. He never saw the governor and the district governor again in his life. He had only heard that they had disappeared behind the mountain of documents piled up in front of him, at one of the many tables, in a dimly lit hall of a huge government office in the capital. He could not understand how the bureaucracy had condemned these people, who had no part in the disaster, to oblivion. The younger brother fell silent. There was no one left in the hotel lobby except us. Before saying goodbye, I said I didn't know any of this. He said thoughtfully, I certainly don't know things either. We hugged like old friends. He went out the door to say goodbye. Our old friend had finished his words. The people around the table quietly dispersed one by one and disappeared into the darkness of the night. Finally, we got up. Before leaving, he said, "Can you hear it?" I listened intently. Then, curiously, I asked, "What?" He smiled. The silence.